The Haunting of Blackwood Manor. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Emily Bennet first laid eyes on Blackwood Manor. The massive Victorian house stood at the edge of the small town of Ravenswood, shrouded in mystery and half-forgotten tales. Emily had never been to Ravenswood before, but she had heard stories about the old mansion from her grandmother, a woman who had spent her final years muttering about the curse that haunted the Bennet family. The house had been in her family for generations, passed down from one descendant to the next, but it had been abandoned for nearly 50 years, ever since Emily's great-uncle, Henry Bennet, disappeared without a trace. No one had lived there since, and the locals whispered that the house was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had perished within its walls. Emily wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but as she stood at the wrought-iron gate staring up at the towering spires and darkened windows of Blackwood Manor, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in the pit of her stomach. The house had been left to her in her grandmother's will, along with a cryptic note that read, "The answers you seek are within the walls of Blackwood Manor, but beware, for the past never stays buried." Emily had no idea what the note meant, but she was determined to find out. She had come to Ravenswood to claim her inheritance, to explore the old house, and perhaps to uncover the truth about her family's past. As she pushed open the creaking gate and made her way up the overgrown path to the front door, she couldn't help but feel that she was being watched. The wind rustled through the trees, and the shadows seemed to shift and move, as if something, or someone, was lurking just out of sight. She reached the front door, a heavy ornate structure made of dark wood and iron, and inserted the old key her grandmother had left her. The lock turned with a loud click, and the door swung open with a groan, revealing a grand foyer bathed in dim light. The air inside was cool and musty, thick with the scent of dust and decay. Cobwebs hung from the high ceiling, and the floorboards creaked underfoot as Emily stepped inside. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the distant ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere deep within the mansion. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself. This was her family's home, and she had every right to be here. She would not be frightened by old ghost stories. She closed the door behind her and began to explore. The interior of Blackwood Manor was just as grand and just as eerie as its exterior. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and the floors were covered in thick, ornate rugs that muffled her footsteps. The furniture was old and worn, covered in a fine layer of dust, but it was clear that the house had once been a place of luxury and wealth. What struck Emily most were the portraits that lined the walls, dozens of them, each one depicting a stern-faced ancestor, their eyes following her as she moved from room to room. The portraits were unsettling, their gazes almost lifelike, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, judging her. She paused in front of one particularly large portrait that hung in the main hallway. It depicted a tall, imposing man with dark hair and piercing eyes, dressed in a formal suit. His expression was severe, almost angry, and Emily found herself wondering who he was. As if in answer to her unspoken question, she noticed a small plaque beneath the portrait, engraved with the name Henry Bennet, her great-uncle. Emily stared at the portrait, her mind racing. This was the man who had disappeared all those years ago, the man who had left the house abandoned. What had happened to him? And why had her grandmother never spoken of him? The answers she knew were somewhere in this house. She just had to find them. As she continued her exploration, she found herself drawn to a narrow staircase at the back of the house, leading up to the second floor. The stairs creaked ominously as she ascended, the air growing colder with each step. The second floor was even darker than the first, the windows covered with heavy drapes that blocked out the light. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she walked down the long, narrow hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar. It was the only room on this floor that wasn't locked, and as she approached, she felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if something important was waiting for her on the other side. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a dresser, and a large ornate mirror on the wall. But what caught Emily's attention was the small writing desk in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. On the desk was an old, leather-bound journal. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she reached for the journal, her fingers trembling. She wiped away the dust and opened the cover, revealing pages filled with neat, cursive handwriting. The journal belonged to Henry Bennet. As Emily sat on the edge of the bed, she began to read the journal, her eyes scanning the yellowed pages with growing unease. The entries were dated from the late 1800s, and they detailed her great-uncle's life in Blackwood Manor, his dealings with the town of Ravenswood, and, most disturbingly, his growing obsession with the occult. Henry had been a man of science, a respected doctor in the community, but as the journal progressed, it became clear that something had changed him. The entries grew darker, more erratic, filled with descriptions of strange rituals and experiments conducted in secret within the manor's walls. One entry, dated October 31st, 1889, caught Emily's attention. It read, "The voices grow louder each night. They speak to me, whispering secrets of life and death, of power beyond imagination. I have discovered the truth. The veil between worlds is thin and it can be torn asunder. I must proceed with the ritual. The sacrifice is necessary. There is no other way." Emily's blood ran cold as she read the words. What had her great-uncle done? What ritual was he referring to? And what sacrifice? She turned the page, eager to find out more, but the next few pages were blank, as if Henry had stopped writing suddenly, his thoughts left unfinished. Frustrated, she flipped through the remaining pages, but they were all blank. The journal ended abruptly, with no explanation for what had happened to Henry Bennet, or the mysterious ritual he had mentioned. Emily closed the journal, her mind racing. She had more questions than ever, but the answers seemed just out of reach, buried in the dark history of Blackwood Manor. As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard a faint sound, a soft creak, like the sound of a door slowly opening. Her heart skipped a beat and she looked up, her eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there, only the shadows and the silence. She stood up, her nerves on edge, and made her way to the door, peering out into the hallway. The house was still, the only sound the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. But as she stepped into the hallway, she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, as if something was watching her, something unseen and malevolent. She turned quickly, her eyes darting to the mirror on the wall. For a split second, she saw a figure standing behind her in the reflection, a tall, dark figure with piercing eyes, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. But when she spun around, the hallway was empty. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, and she backed away from the mirror, her mind reeling. Had she imagined it? Or was there something in this house, something that had been awakened by her presence? She didn't know, and she didn't want to find out. Clutching the journal to her chest, she fled down the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the silent house. She needed to get out, needed to leave Blackwood Manor before it was too late. But as she reached the front door, she froze. The door was wide open, swinging slowly on its hinges. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light, was a figure, a tall, dark figure with piercing eyes. Henry Bennet. Emily's scream caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a wave of terror through her entire being. "Emily," the figure said, his voice low and menacing. "You should not have come here." She backed away, her heart pounding, but there was nowhere to go, no way to escape. The house seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive as the figure advanced. "I was so close," Henry continued, his voice filled with anger and desperation. "So close to unlocking the secrets of life and death, but they stopped me. They took everything from me, and now they will take you too." The air grew cold, the temperature dropping rapidly as the figure reached out toward her, his hand ghostly pale, his fingers long and skeletal. Emily wanted to run, wanted to scream, but she was frozen in place, her body paralyzed with fear. And then, just as his fingers brushed against her skin, the lights flickered and went out. The house was plunged into darkness. Emily's scream finally tore free as she stumbled backward, her eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden darkness. She could hear Henry's voice, low and sinister, whispering her name, taunting her, but she couldn't see him, couldn't see anything. She fumbled in the darkness, her hands searching for something, anything that could help her find her way out. But the house seemed to shift around her, the walls closing in, the floor tilting beneath her feet. And then in the distance, she saw a faint light, flickering like a candle in the darkness. Without thinking, she ran toward it, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The light grew brighter as she approached, and she realized it was coming from the basement, from the narrow stairway that led down to the depths of Blackwood Manor. She hesitated for only a moment before descending the stairs, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The light flickered and danced, casting eerie shadows on the walls, but she kept going, driven by a desperate need to escape, to survive. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a large, stone-walled chamber, the walls lined with strange symbols and markings that glowed faintly in the dim light. In the center of the room was an altar, and on the altar was a book, an old leather-bound tome, similar to the journal she had found upstairs. But this book was different, older, more sinister. As she approached the altar, she felt a strange pull, a compulsion to open the book to read the words written within. She resisted at first, but the pull was too strong, the need too overwhelming. With trembling hands, she opened the book and began to read. The words were in a language she didn't understand, ancient and arcane. But as she read, she felt a strange sensation, as if the words were seeping into her mind, filling her with knowledge, with power. The room grew colder, the air thick with the scent of decay, and she could hear the distant sound of chanting, of voices whispering in the darkness. She looked up and saw Henry standing across the room, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You have begun the ritual," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You have unlocked the secrets of Blackwood Manor, now you must finish it." Emily shook her head, fear and confusion clouding her mind. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't want to understand, but the book was speaking to her, urging her to continue, to complete the ritual. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't do it. I won't." Henry's eyes narrowed, and he stepped forward, his presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You have no choice," he said, his voice cold and final. "The ritual must be completed, the sacrifice must be made." Emily backed away, her heart pounding, but she couldn't escape the pull of the book, couldn't resist the compulsion to finish what had been started. The voices grew louder, the chanting more insistent, and she felt a cold, clammy hand on her shoulder, pulling her toward the altar. "No!" she screamed, trying to break free, but it was too late. The ritual had begun. The air in the chamber grew thick and suffocating as the chanting reached a fever pitch. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, pulsing with an otherworldly energy that seemed to vibrate through Emily's very bones. Henry stood at the edge of the room, his eyes locked on hers, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. He had failed to complete the ritual all those years ago, and now he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The book in Emily's hands burned with a cold fire, the words on the pages twisting and shifting as if alive, compelling her to speak them aloud, to summon whatever dark force lay waiting in the shadows. She fought against it with every ounce of strength she had, but the power of the ritual was too strong. Her lips moved of their own accord, the ancient words spilling out in a language she couldn't understand, but somehow knew in the deepest recesses of her mind. As the final words left her lips, the room fell deathly silent. For a moment, nothing happened. The air was still, the shadows unmoving. Emily dared to hope that she had somehow stopped the ritual, that it had all been a terrible dream. But then the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The walls shook, the symbols glowing with an intense, blinding light. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the chamber, growing louder and more violent with each passing second. And then, from the darkness, something emerged. It was a presence, a force, unlike anything Emily had ever encountered. It was not human, not of this world, but something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting, watching, for centuries. The air grew cold as the presence filled the room, its power pressing down on Emily, suffocating her, drowning her in an overwhelming sense of despair and terror. Standing across the room where Henry had been was another figure, a woman, pale and ghostly, with long flowing hair and eyes that glowed with an eerie light. It was her grandmother. "Emily," the figure said, her voice soft and mournful, "you should never have come here." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she stared at the ghostly figure of her grandmother, the truth of the ritual finally sinking in. the sacrifice had not been of blood or flesh, but of something far more precious, her soul. As the figure of her grandmother began to fade, Emily felt a cold hand on her shoulder, and she knew with a sickening certainty that she was now bound to Blackwood Manor, just as her ancestors had been before her. The ritual had been completed, the curse fulfilled, and there was no escape. The days and weeks that followed passed in a blur for the people of Ravenswood. They spoke in hushed tones about the strange lights and sounds that had come from Blackwood Manor on that fateful night, and they whispered about Emily Bennet, the young woman who had come to claim her inheritance and had never been seen again. The authorities searched the house, but they found no sign of Emily, only an old, dusty journal and a book filled with strange, indecipherable symbols. The house was sealed off, declared unsafe, but the townspeople knew the truth. Blackwood Manor was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had perished within its walls, bound forever by the dark rituals that had been performed there. And so the house was left to rot, abandoned and forgotten, a relic of a dark past that refused to stay buried. But the legend of Blackwood Manor lived on, passed down from generation to generation, a tale of a family cursed by their own ambition, of a young woman who had sought answers and paid the ultimate price. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the trees, the people of Ravenswood would tell the story of Emily Bennet, the last of the Bennet line, and the dark force that still waited in the shadows of Blackwood Manor, waiting for the next soul to claim.